It was a frigid February morning in 1968 when the Soviet ballistic missile submarine K-129 slipped quietly from its base at Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky and disappeared beneath the grey waters of the Pacific. To Moscow it was a routine deterrence patrol, one more silent guardian carrying nuclear warheads to the far reaches of the ocean. The men aboard, 98 in all, knew their task well: remain undetected, track American submarines, and wait for orders that everyone hoped would never come. The sea around Kamchatka was bleak and metallic. As the sub descended, sunlight faded from the periscope glass until nothing remained but the dull red glow of control panels and the steady pulse of the reactor. K-129 vanished beneath the thermocline, becoming another invisible weapon in a world balanced on fear. For several weeks everything seemed normal. Radio check-ins were punctual, transmissions coded and brief. Then, in early March, the signals stopped. Hours stretched into days, and the Soviet Navy's communications officers felt the creeping weight of uncertainty. They tried every emergency frequency, but no reply came. By mid-month, the Northern Fleet accepted what no one wanted to say aloud: the submarine and her crew were gone. An urgent search operation began across thousands of miles of open water. Dozens of vessels combed the Pacific, dropping sonar buoys, tracing patterns across empty grids, finding only wind and waves. The official explanation was simple: mechanical failure, presumed lost with all hands. But inside the Kremlin, suspicion grew darker. Some believed it had collided with an American boat, others whispered about sabotage or mutiny. None of it could be proven, and none of it would bring the sailors home. Across the ocean, another set of ears had heard what Moscow could not. The United States maintained an immense underwater listening system known as SOSUS, a chain of hydrophones anchored to the seafloor to track the movement of submarines through the world's oceans. On March 8, analysts at Pearl Harbor detected a deep, concussive thud followed by a long metallic rumble, a sound unlike anything they had logged before. It was not volcanic, not seismic. To trained listeners, it was unmistakable: the implosion of a submarine crushed under pressure. Triangulating the signal placed the event roughly 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, directly in the patrol path of the missing K-129. While the Soviets searched blind, the Americans suddenly knew almost exactly where their enemy's lost submarine lay. What the sonar data revealed ignited imagination at the highest levels of U.S. intelligence. Somewhere under 3 miles of cold, black water rested a fully armed Soviet nuclear platform, a vessel that might contain code books, missile guidance computers, encryption keys, and perhaps intact warheads. If those artifacts could be recovered, the United States would gain an unprecedented look into Soviet strategic systems. The technical challenge, however, bordered on impossible. No human being had ever worked at that depth. No salvage technology on Earth could lift thousands of tons from the ocean floor. Even so, within the walls of the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology, engineers began sketching ideas that seemed to belong more to science fiction than espionage. By April 1968, those sketches hardened into a daring proposal. The plan was to raise the Soviet submarine from nearly 17,000 feet below the surface, intact, in secret, and without the Soviets ever realizing it had been touched. It would require designing machines larger than skyscrapers, a vessel stronger than any built before, and absolute operational secrecy. Only a handful of senior officials were told, each sworn to silence under threat of treason. The project received a deliberately meaningless code name, Azorian. From that day, America embarked on one of the most audacious covert engineering feats in history, a mission to steal the deadliest secrets of its greatest rival from the bottom of the sea. The first images of the wreck came not from cameras, but from sound. In a dim operations room in Pearl Harbor, analysts traced acoustic lines on long strips of chart paper, each spike a whisper from the deep. Using triangulation, they mapped the implosion's echo until the coordinates converged into a single, lonely patch of ocean far beyond any shipping lane. That was where K-129 had died. The data was passed quietly to Washington, and within days the information reached the Central Intelligence Agency, where senior officers realized what it might mean. If they could locate the submarine, they might recover the Soviets' nuclear launch codes and encryption devices, treasures of immense intelligence value. But there was one problem: it lay deeper than any wreck ever recovered. The U.S. Navy dispatched a reconnaissance ship, the USS Halibut, disguised as an ordinary research vessel. Its real mission was to find the Soviet submarine before Moscow did. For weeks, the Halibut scoured the ocean floor, dragging an array of cameras and sonar instruments over an area larger than the state of Maryland. The crew worked in silence, surrounded by secrecy. Then, after hundreds of hours of film and miles of sonar data, the image appeared, grainy, ghostly, but unmistakable. A broken steel hull lying upright on the seabed, its missile hatches still sealed. They had found K-129. When the photographs reached Langley, a stunned silence filled the briefing room. The submarine was remarkably intact. Inside could be code books, navigation charts, even nuclear missiles, each a priceless window into the Soviet strategic arsenal. Yet the depth was staggering, nearly 16,500 feet, 3 times deeper than the Titanic. No submarine, no crane, and no known machine could reach that far down. Engineers who examined the data said it was impossible. The pressures would crush any recovery device long before it touched the wreck. And still, the CIA refused to walk away. If the Soviets couldn't retrieve their dead, perhaps America could, and in doing so, learn everything about how they fought and how they planned to survive a nuclear war. Within months, the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology assembled a small, compartmentalized task force to explore whether the feat could even be attempted. They studied undersea mining rigs, deep ocean oil platforms, and the early work of marine engineer Global Marine Incorporated, whose expertise in drilling technology seemed closest to what the mission demanded. The concept that emerged was almost unbelievable: a ship that would disguise its purpose by pretending to mine the ocean floor for minerals. Using that cover story, the CIA could construct and operate a vessel large enough to lower a claw, an immense mechanical arm, nearly 3 miles into the sea, and pull up the submarine in secret. The risk was unimaginable. If the Soviets discovered the operation, it could be seen as an act of war. The ship itself would have to remain at sea for months, hovering motionless above the wreck while assembling thousands of feet of pipe. The cost would exceed $300 million, the most expensive covert project in American history. But Director of Central Intelligence Richard Helms approved it. The potential reward, a complete Soviet nuclear launch system, was worth the gamble. Thus, the blueprints for Project Azorian were born, and with them, the first outlines of one of the strangest ships ever built, the Hughes Glomar Explorer. Inside the CIA headquarters at Langley, the mood was divided between exhilaration and disbelief. The technical reports confirmed that K-129 was real, reachable, and intact, but the sheer scale of what it would take to bring it up left even veteran officers uneasy. The engineers spoke of new alloys, deep pressure joints, and cables longer than any ever built. The finance division estimated costs that dwarfed most entire CIA operations. And then there was the question of secrecy. A conventional Navy recovery would never work. The press, the Soviets, and even America's allies would demand explanations. To pull this off, the agency needed absolute invisibility, not only at sea, but in Congress and the world beyond. Director Richard Helms convened a small circle of trusted officials. Around the table sat representatives from the Navy, the Defense Department, and the CIA's own Directorate of Science and Technology. The proposal on the table was simple in phrasing, terrifying in implication: recover the Soviet submarine intact, without the Soviets ever knowing. Some warned that a failure could trigger a diplomatic crisis or worse. Others argued that success could change the entire balance of nuclear deterrence. The debate raged for weeks, a tug-of-war between caution and ambition. In the end, ambition won. Helms approved the operation under the most restricted classification available, top secret number. With authorization secured, the next obstacle was money. The budget line could not appear in any public record, not even under a disguised title. Funds would have to be buried within other defense projects and funneled through civilian corporations to disguise their origin. The agency quietly approached Global Marine, a California firm experienced in deep-sea drilling. Its engineers had already pushed technology to depths few thought possible. They would serve as the project's backbone, though only a handful of executives would know the true objective. The rest were told they were developing technology for deep ocean mining, a frontier industry the world was only beginning to imagine. At Langley, planners wrestled with the most delicate question of all: what if the Soviets discovered the operation midway? The location of K-129 was international waters, but the act of seizing a foreign military asset could easily be seen as aggression. The ship could be shadowed, intercepted, or worse, attacked. To avoid that, the mission would need an airtight cover story and a civilian figurehead powerful enough to deflect scrutiny. Someone whose name alone could mask the absurdity of a ship designed to mine the ocean floor for metal nodules. The answer came from the fringes of American industry and eccentric genius, Howard Hughes. Hughes was a billionaire recluse, a legend of aviation and cinema, and a man whose reputation for wild, visionary projects made him the perfect decoy. If he claimed to be building a giant vessel to extract minerals from the seabed, the public would believe it. The CIA approached him through intermediaries, offering to fund the entire project and allow him to take public credit. Hughes agreed, or rather, never openly refused. It was a symbiosis of convenience. He provided his name, the agency provided the technology, and both sides gained plausible deniability. Thus, the Hughes Glomar Explorer was born on paper, a ship that would pretend to mine the sea, while secretly hunting a ghost of the Cold War. By late 1969, the first contracts were signed under front companies. Blueprints began to circulate among a handful of engineers sworn to silence. Every bolt, weld, and cable had to withstand the pressure of an ocean that could crush a locomotive. Entire new hydraulic systems were invented to connect thousands of feet of pipe. Inside Langley, a small control cell coordinated logistics under the innocuous name Project Jennifer, a second layer of disguise to protect the real code name, Azorian. The CIA's dilemma had turned into momentum. What had started as a desperate idea was now an unstoppable machine of secrecy, ambition, and engineering brilliance. The world above had no idea what was about to rise from the deep. The challenge facing the engineers was staggering. No machine in history had ever attempted to lift such weight from such depth. At nearly 3 miles below the surface, the pressure would reach more than 8,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crush a steel sphere flat. The CIA's chosen partner, Global Marine Incorporated, quickly realized that conventional equipment could not survive. Everything, every bolt, piston, and bearing, would have to be designed from scratch. The goal was audacious, a ship large enough to hold an entire Soviet submarine, strong enough to resist the Pacific, and stable enough to maintain position over a single point of ocean for months without drifting an inch. The core of the idea was a vertical lifting system that resembled a giant oil drilling rig. The ship would lower a continuous pipe string, section by section, down through a massive moon pool in its hull. At the end of that pipe would be the capture vehicle, an enormous claw built from reinforced steel, codenamed Clementine. Once in place, the claw would grasp the wreck of K-129 and raise it to the surface, retracting the pipes one at a time. Every piece of equipment had to function flawlessly, because a single failure at that depth would mean losing everything: the submarine, the ship, and the secret itself. In a cavernous shipyard in San Diego, construction began under the tightest security the U.S. government could impose on a civilian project. Only a fraction of the workforce knew what they were truly building. To most, it was the Hughes mining barge, part of Howard Hughes's latest adventure in deep-sea mineral extraction. Engineers worked around the clock, often in sealed sections of the yard guarded by plainclothes CIA officers. The project consumed so much steel that suppliers began to ask questions. Each time, the agency provided vague answers about a revolutionary mining technology that would change global industry. Inside Langley, the project managers began to realize that secrecy was as fragile as steel under pressure. Keeping thousands of workers silent was an impossible task, so they shifted to information compartmentalization. Welders knew only what they were cutting. Electricians saw only the panels they wired. The few who understood the whole design operated behind locked doors and signed agreements that forbade them to speak for the rest of their lives. Every document, from blueprints to payroll receipts, was classified. Even the project's budget line was disguised under unrelated defense programs. By 1972, the hull of the Hughes Glomar Explorer towered over the San Diego waterfront, an immense, boxy vessel unlike anything afloat. At 619 feet long and more than 35,000 tons, it was larger than most aircraft carriers. Beneath its midsection lay a retractable capture bay, a kind of hidden garage where the recovered submarine would be stored in total secrecy. Above deck, cranes, gantries, and hydraulic towers loomed like the skeleton of a floating skyscraper. It was a machine built to deceive the world, an engineering miracle hidden behind the mask of a mining ship. To complete the illusion, the CIA commissioned a wave of public relations around the Hughes deep ocean mining project. Magazines ran stories about futuristic plans to harvest manganese nodules from the seabed. Hughes's reputation for eccentric genius made it all believable. Behind the headlines, the agency's real crew trained quietly on navigation, pressure control, and classified recovery protocols. Every move had to appear routine, every action ordinary. By the time the ship was finished, its true purpose was known to fewer than 200 people in the entire world. As the final bolts were welded and the paint dried, the magnitude of what they had built began to sink in. The Glomar Explorer wasn't just a vessel, it was a statement of willpower. The United States had built a machine capable of touching the bottom of the sea, of reaching into the graveyard of the Cold War and pulling secrets back to the surface. Whether it would work was another question entirely. The engineers could only hope the ocean would allow them one miracle. Howard Hughes was the perfect illusion, a billionaire recluse whose reputation blurred the line between genius and madness. To the CIA, he was a ready-made smoke screen. His name alone could justify any extravagant, secretive project. A massive ship built to mine minerals from the deep ocean? Of course Hughes would do that. After all, this was the man who built the Spruce Goose, designed experimental aircraft, and bought whole hotels just to vanish from the public eye. The agency didn't need him to participate directly, it only needed his brand of eccentricity. Behind the cover story, the operation was officially presented as the Hughes Deep Ocean Mining Project. Press releases claimed the ship would pioneer a new industry, harvesting manganese nodules, small metallic rocks rich in valuable minerals that lay scattered across the ocean floor. The story was perfect. It sounded scientific, visionary, and just absurd enough to be believable. Hughes's public relations team, some of whom had no idea the CIA was involved, promoted the venture as the next frontier of industrial exploration. Newspapers printed glowing articles about the coming revolution in deep-sea mining. Even government agencies outside the intelligence circle believed it was real. Yet the real Hughes was growing increasingly unpredictable. By the early 1970s, he was reclusive, heavily medicated, and living in hotel penthouses surrounded by aides who filtered all communication. Reaching him directly was nearly impossible. The CIA's intermediaries dealt instead with his corporate network, Hughes Tool Company and Sumar Corporation, which agreed to lend his name and infrastructure for a modest fee. But Hughes's isolation caused chaos. At one point, conflicting orders nearly revealed the project's budget. Another time, a journalist investigating his finances stumbled close to a paper trail connected to the Glomar Explorer. The agency intervened quietly, redirecting the inquiry and burying the story. Meanwhile, Soviet naval intelligence had begun to take notice. Satellites and surveillance reports described a massive new American ship taking shape in California, linked somehow to the eccentric billionaire. The Soviet embassy in Washington filed quiet queries through back channels, asking what the purpose of the vessel was. The U.S. State Department responded casually, claiming it was an experimental mining platform with no military value. Still, suspicions grew in Moscow. American ships had been sighted conducting research near the K-129 site years earlier. Soviet analysts couldn't connect the dots yet, but the coincidence lingered in their reports. To sustain the illusion, the CIA choreographed a campaign of misdirection. Scientists were invited to tour unrelated global marine facilities. Trade journals were fed selective details about new mining technologies. Even at sea, the ship would broadcast legitimate oceanographic data to sell its cover story. The agency called this deep concealment by normalcy, the art of hiding the extraordinary inside the ordinary. By late 1973, the Hughes Glomar Explorer was ready for launch. Its construction had cost the equivalent of $350 million, an astronomical sum disguised across multiple budgets. Every piece of paperwork, every invoice, carried the Hughes name, not the CIA's. From the outside, it was one man's eccentric dream. From within, it was America's most audacious act of espionage. When the ship finally slid into the water, journalists applauded the birth of a technological marvel. Cameras captured its towering cranes and gleaming hull, unaware that deep inside lay a hidden bay large enough to swallow a submarine. On the decks, men in hard hats waved to the press, smiling beneath the weight of silence. They knew the truth, and they knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The cover story had worked. Now, the mission to raise the lost submarine could begin. But the ocean, indifferent and immense, had its own plans. The Hughes Glomar Explorer rose from the San Diego shipyard like something from another world. It was neither ship nor platform, neither civilian vessel nor war machine, but something in between, built for a single impossible task. Beneath its steel decks lay a hollow bay the size of a football field, sealed from view by hydraulic doors. Inside that hidden space, the CIA planned to cradle an entire Soviet submarine, hoisted secretly from the depths of the Pacific. Every inch of the vessel had been engineered for deception. To the untrained eye, it was a mining ship. To those who knew, it was a floating vault of classified technology. The final outfitting was an operation in itself. Engineers from Global Marine, under CIA supervision, installed an enormous derrick tower at the ship's center, built to bear the crushing load of the capture vehicle. The moon pool below, a rectangular opening that extended straight through the hull, was fitted with pressure doors to conceal its purpose. Above deck, cranes, sensors, and satellite dishes were disguised as geological research equipment. Even the crew quarters were designed to look ordinary, though behind a few locked hatches lay rooms filled with encrypted communications gear and classified control systems. Training the crew was another challenge. Most were civilian specialists, welders, drill operators, engineers, and technicians, handpicked for skill and silence. Before boarding, they signed lifetime secrecy agreements and underwent briefings that omitted the most crucial truth. They were told they would be conducting a deep ocean mineral recovery test. Only a small inner circle, known as the Special Projects Team, knew the mission's real objective. These men would monitor the descent of the capture claw, guide its movements, and oversee the recovery of whatever could be lifted from the seafloor. Their instructions were clear: if the Soviets appeared, deny everything. Every system was tested repeatedly, often at night to avoid attention. The derrick's hydraulics groaned under simulated loads. The pipe-handling machinery, capable of lowering and retrieving over 16,000 feet of connected pipe, was calibrated to fractions of an inch. Engineers ran calculations for temperature differentials, current drifts, and metal fatigue. Each equation revealed the same truth: the margin for error was nearly zero. A single broken weld, a jammed joint, or a shift in the ocean's current could destroy the entire mission. Yet for all the tension, the atmosphere aboard was one of cautious pride. The crew knew they were part of something unprecedented. The ship carried more computing power than most research centers of the time, and its control systems were decades ahead of their era. The Glomar Explorer was, in every sense, a Cold War cathedral, a structure built not of faith, but of fear and genius. By early 1974, the vessel was complete. Hughes's name gleamed across the bow in bold black letters. The world saw a billionaire's technological wonder. Only a few saw the weapon hidden beneath its decks. In June, after one final systems check, the order came from Langley: the ship would sail for the recovery site. As the sun rose over the California coast, tugs pulled the massive vessel from its berth. On shore, reporters waved, cameras flashed, and officials gave hollow smiles. They called it the most ambitious mining expedition in history. But as the Glomar Explorer disappeared over the horizon, those who knew the truth felt something colder. The deception had worked. Now the sea would decide whether it had been worth it. The Hughes Glomar Explorer left the California coast in the summer of 1974, gliding into the Pacific beneath a shroud of routine. Officially, it was bound for a deep-sea mining zone, an experiment that would test mankind's ability to harvest metals from the ocean floor. Unofficially, every soul aboard was heading toward one of the most secret graves of the Cold War. The course led them to an empty expanse of sea, 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, an area so remote that even shipping routes avoided it. The ocean there was endless and blue, the horizon a ring of silence. It was here, beneath nearly 3 miles of water, that the Soviet submarine K-129 lay waiting. Life aboard the Glomar Explorer followed a strange rhythm. Days blurred together under the monotony of open water, broken only by drills and system checks. The crew called the ship the city that floats in circles, since it had to remain almost perfectly stationary, guided by a complex dynamic positioning system that adjusted the ship's propellers automatically to counter waves and currents. Even a few feet of drift could mean disaster once the claw began its descent. The engineers monitored the machinery constantly, running endless tests on hydraulics, guidance sensors, and stabilization systems. Everything had to work the first time, there would be no second chance. Most of the men on board knew only fragments of the truth. They had been told they were testing new mining equipment for Hughes's ocean exploration company. But rumors had started to spread, quiet conversations over coffee, glances exchanged in the corridors. Some wondered why so much secrecy surrounded a mining experiment. Others noticed the military precision of the command structure, the coded radio calls, the plainclothes security personnel. Only a small group of insiders, hidden behind the locked doors of the special projects room, knew the real target below. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Outside, the Pacific stretched to infinity, indifferent and serene. Inside, every clang of metal, every vibration of machinery echoed through the decks like a warning. In the operations center, technicians watched sonar displays, the glowing green outlines of the seafloor appearing slowly on the monitors. As the ship reached the designated coordinates, a hush fell over the control room. The Glomar Explorer had arrived directly above the wreck. Preparations began immediately. The massive derrick came alive, cranes swinging into position, hydraulics hissing as they lifted the first segment of the long steel pipe. Section by section, the pipe string would extend downward through the moon pool, a column of machinery nearly 3 miles long. At the end of it waited the Clementine claw, folded like the fingers of a sleeping giant. The descent would take days, each new pipe lowered carefully and locked into place. As night fell over the Pacific, the lights of the Glomar Explorer glowed like a floating city. Few on board slept. They knew that once the claw reached the bottom, they would be performing a task that no one had ever attempted, and that no one outside the ship would ever know about. Above them was starlight. Below them, the silent wreck of a foreign power. Between those two worlds hung a ship built on lies, courage, and the desperate hope that it might just succeed. The descent began before dawn. In the control room of the Hughes Glomar Explorer, engineers gathered around glowing consoles, their faces illuminated by screens that tracked pressure, temperature, and depth. Outside, the Pacific was calm, a glassy surface stretching endlessly to the horizon. Below, the sea fell away into blackness. At 17,000 feet, no sunlight had ever touched the ocean floor. The claw, codenamed Clementine, began its journey down through that frozen darkness, lowered one pipe section at a time through the ship's moon pool. Each segment was 40 feet long and weighed several tons. The process was slow, deliberate, and exhausting. The crew called it feeding the sea, as if they were lowering a mechanical serpent into the abyss. Every hour, the operators added a new section, bolting it to the one before it and testing the joint for stress. On the monitors, depth numbers climbed steadily. 1,000 feet. 2,000. 5,000. Soon the pressure on the equipment reached levels few machines had ever endured. If even a single weld failed, the entire pipe string could collapse, falling like a metallic whip through the depths. Inside the ship, time lost its meaning. Shifts blurred together, men worked 20-hour days fueled by coffee and adrenaline. The Pacific remained eerily calm, as if nature itself were holding its breath. Engineers monitored the descent through faint sonar echoes, the only way to know what was happening miles below. At around 14,000 feet, the readings began to show turbulence. A crosscurrent had developed, invisible but powerful, tugging at the pipe. The vessel's dynamic positioning system roared to life, spinning the ship's propellers in tiny adjustments to hold position. It was a ballet of precision, a struggle between machine and ocean. Finally, after days of descent, a ghostly shape appeared on the sonar screen, the broken outline of a submarine lying on its side. The control room fell silent. Through remote cameras attached to the pipe string, they saw the first glimpses of K-129. The images were grainy, distorted by darkness and debris, but unmistakable. The conning tower tilted, the hull cracked open, the Soviet red star still faintly visible on a fragment of metal. It was like seeing a relic from another world. The Clementine claw unfolded slowly, its massive arms opening wide as it approached the wreck. Every motion was controlled from the ship above, delayed by seconds due to the immense distance. The operators guided it gently, aligning the claw with the midsection of the submarine, the area believed to contain the missile compartment and code room. The tension in the control room was palpable. No one spoke, afraid that even a whisper might break the concentration. Then, at last, the claw made contact. The pressure sensors flickered, registering weight. The mechanical fingers closed, gripping the cold steel of the submarine's hull. After 6 years of planning, the impossible had happened. America had touched the lost Soviet submarine. In that moment, the crew of the Glomar Explorer believed they might actually succeed. But 3 miles below, the ocean was patient. And it was not finished testing them. The ascent began slowly, each motion calculated with surgical precision. In the early hours of the morning, the Hughes Glomar Explorer hummed with restrained energy. Below the surface, the Clementine claw began pulling the captured wreck of K-129 upward through nearly 3 miles of water. The weight was unimaginable, thousands of tons of twisted steel, dragging against currents that wanted to keep it buried forever. In the control room, the tension was suffocating. The smallest tremor in the data could mean catastrophe. At first, everything went according to plan. The sensors showed stable pressure, steady alignment, and minimal drift. Operators called out readings in calm, rehearsed voices. Section by section, the long pipe string was drawn upward and disassembled, each joint locked into its cradle before the next was hoisted. On the surface, the sea was unnaturally calm, the kind of stillness sailors distrust. Beneath, invisible forces were gathering. As the wreck rose past the halfway point, warning lights began to flash. The tension on the lifting cables spiked beyond tolerance. Hydraulic pumps screamed as the load shifted. The engineers scrambled to rebalance the system, adjusting the ship's position to compensate for the ocean's pull. Then, somewhere deep below, a muffled crack echoed through the monitoring systems, a sound like distant thunder. The entire control room froze. Pressure readings dropped sharply. One of the claw's massive arms had fractured. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The operators held their breath, praying the remaining arms could hold. Then came the second sound, louder, final. The pressure sensors flatlined. Somewhere in the abyss, the claw had torn apart, and half of K-129 began to fall. The sonar feed filled with chaos, tumbling debris, clouds of silt, the twisted shapes of bulkheads breaking apart as gravity reclaimed them. In the control room, there was nothing anyone could do. The feed went black. The silence that followed was unbearable. Dozens of men stared at their screens, unable to speak. After years of secrecy, billions of dollars, and 6 years of work, half the prize had been lost in seconds. What remained in the claw was uncertain, perhaps a small section of the hull, perhaps nothing at all. But then, faintly, the sensors flickered back to life. Some weight remained. The claw had not failed completely. In the dim light of the control room, the mission commander made his decision. The lift would continue. Whatever remained of the wreck would be brought up, no matter how little it was. As the ship resumed its slow ascent, the mood shifted from elation to grim determination. They had come too far to turn back. Hours later, as the remaining section neared the surface, the crew gathered around the sealed bay doors. The ocean water drained away, leaving behind the broken remains of a submarine that had once carried the power to destroy cities. Inside were fragments of steel, shattered instruments, and, most haunting of all, the preserved remains of 6 Soviet sailors, entombed in silence since 1968. No one spoke. Even the hum of machinery seemed to fade. The men understood that they were standing above both triumph and tragedy, a moment that blurred the line between victory and desecration. The recovered fragment of K-129 was lowered into the ship's hidden bay and sealed behind thick steel doors. The atmosphere inside the Hughes Glomar Explorer shifted from adrenaline to solemn disbelief. The operation had worked, partly. What lay before them was not a complete submarine, but a twisted, half-collapsed relic of the Cold War. And inside it, history waited to be unwrapped. CIA engineers, technicians, and naval specialists entered the bay in protective suits. Cameras documented every inch of the wreckage under dim white lights. Among the debris they found corroded electronics, shattered panels, and scattered remnants of crew quarters frozen in time. Inside a partially intact compartment, divers recovered 2 nuclear torpedoes, still sealed, and several items the agency had hoped for, fragments of cryptographic equipment, pieces of code books, and even a few handwritten notes. They were small finds, but priceless. Then came the most human discovery. Within the wreckage, lying side by side in the narrow corridor, were the bodies of 6 Soviet sailors, their uniforms preserved by the cold and pressure. The room fell silent. For all the secrecy and ambition that had fueled Project Azorian, this moment brought an unspoken reckoning. These were men, not enemies, not intelligence targets, but sailors who had died doing their duty. The mission commander requested immediate instructions from Langley. The response was brief: treat the remains with respect. Over the following days, the crew prepared a burial at sea. A simple steel casket was built from recovered fragments of the submarine's hull. The sailors' remains were placed inside, wrapped in white cloth. On the morning of September 4, 1974, the Glomar Explorer came to a halt above the wreck site. The crew assembled quietly on deck as the American flag fluttered weakly in the Pacific wind. A chaplain read a short passage: "We commit these souls to the deep, in recognition of their service and the shared courage of all who sail beneath the sea." As cameras recorded the ceremony, the casket was lowered slowly into the water, disappearing beneath the waves that had kept their secret for 6 years. When it was over, no one applauded. Many of the crew turned away, some with tears in their eyes. It was a moment no one had expected, a burial conducted by one superpower for the fallen of another, in absolute secrecy. Back in the control room, the recovered artifacts were catalogued and locked away in sealed containers. The operation had succeeded only in part, but what it achieved was enough to rewrite intelligence history. The CIA had raised a Soviet nuclear submarine from nearly 3 miles down, a feat no other nation had even attempted. Yet the victory was hollow. The cost had been astronomical, the strain immense, and the truth too sensitive to ever be told. When the ship finally turned for home, the Pacific seemed endless again, calm and blank, as if nothing had ever happened there. Beneath its surface, the rest of K-129 still lay in silence, holding secrets no one would ever touch. By early 1975, the Hughes Glomar Explorer had returned quietly to port. Its mission was officially over, though no one outside a handful of officials knew what it had truly accomplished. The crew dispersed, bound by oaths of silence. In Langley, the recovered materials were locked in vaults deep within CIA headquarters. Reports were written, circulated among the highest levels of government, and then sealed away. To the public, the Glomar Explorer was nothing more than an odd industrial curiosity, an expensive ocean mining experiment that had come and gone with little fanfare. But secrets that large rarely stay buried. That spring, investigative journalists in Washington began to receive anonymous tips. Someone inside the intelligence community had whispered of a billion-dollar ship built for a mysterious recovery mission. One of those reporters was Seymour Hersh, already famous for exposing the My Lai massacre. In March 1975, the Los Angeles Times published a quiet bombshell, an article revealing that the United States had attempted to raise a sunken Soviet submarine from the Pacific. The story made front-page news across the world within hours. Panic rippled through the CIA. The operation had been one of the most expensive and classified in the agency's history, and now it was out in the open. Senior officials scrambled to limit the damage. Press briefings were flooded with questions. Was the story true? Had the US violated international law? Was Howard Hughes involved? The answers could not be given without igniting a diplomatic crisis. The White House and the CIA settled on a single response, a phrase designed to reveal nothing and admit nothing. When asked to confirm the reports, a CIA spokesperson replied, "We can neither confirm nor deny the existence of such an operation." That line would go down in history as the Glomar response, the perfect embodiment of Cold War secrecy, a statement of denial that denied nothing. It became official language for silence itself, repeated in courtrooms, press briefings, and congressional hearings for decades afterward. In Moscow, the revelation caused outrage and disbelief. Soviet officials demanded explanations through back channels, but Washington stood firm, repeating the same sterile phrase. Privately, the Soviets already suspected the truth. Reconnaissance satellites had captured images of the Glomar Explorer hovering for weeks over the K-129 site. The new confirmation only deepened their resentment. To them, the mission was grave robbery disguised as science. To the Americans, it was a necessary act of intelligence, and perhaps a final victory in a war fought largely in the shadows. As public fascination grew, the cover story of deep-sea mining collapsed under scrutiny. Hughes's companies distanced themselves, claiming ignorance of any covert operations. Reporters besieged his offices with questions that went unanswered. For the CIA, the exposure marked the end of an era, a moment when technological ambition had outpaced the ability to keep secrets. Behind the headlines, officials knew the mission's legacy could never be measured in intelligence alone. The Glomar Explorer had proven that human engineering could reach where imagination once stopped, and that the ocean itself could not protect secrets forever. Yet now that truth was in the open, the myth of invincibility that had surrounded the agency began to crack. The ship that had once fooled the world was now famous for what it tried to hide. And somewhere in the Pacific, far below the calm surface, the rest of K-129 still lay undisturbed, watching, perhaps, as the secret it had carried for years finally surfaced into history. For years after the story broke, the CIA refused to acknowledge what truly happened in that silent corner of the Pacific. Official statements were vague, documents redacted, and witnesses bound to lifelong secrecy. Even within the agency, Only a small circle knew the full scope of Project Azorian, its triumphs, its failures, and its haunting moral cost. What had begun as an engineering miracle ended as a lesson in the limits of human control. The ocean had yielded its secrets only partially, reminding both superpowers that not even the best machines could outwit the deep. In the decades that followed, fragments of the story began to surface. Retired engineers spoke carefully of their ocean mining experiment. Declassified memos revealed budgets, technical drawings, and cables that confirmed what had long been suspected: the mission had succeeded in raising part of K-129, and in doing so, had changed the very language of secrecy. The phrase, "we can neither confirm nor deny," became institutional doctrine, used not only for covert operations but for everything from satellite programs to intelligence inquiries. The Glomar response had become a philosophy, silence weaponized. The ship itself, stripped of classified systems, was later sold for civilian use, its towering derrick and moon pool repurposed for legitimate deep-sea drilling. Yet even as it sailed under a new name, traces of its old identity clung to it. Those who had served aboard spoke of it with quiet reverence, a machine that had touched death and history at the same time. In the halls of Langley, the project remained an unspoken benchmark of ambition. Every covert program that followed was measured against it, though none matched its audacity. In 1992, nearly 2 decades after the recovery, the CIA released a short video to the Russian government. It showed the burial at sea, the American flag, the folded steel coffin, the solemn crew committing the 6 Soviet sailors to the deep. Moscow responded with gratitude. For the first time, the human side of Project Azorian was acknowledged, not as a theft, but as a rare act of respect between enemies who had once stood at the edge of annihilation. Today, the wreck of K-129 still rests on the ocean floor, a rusting monument to the Cold War's secret wars. The currents sweep through its broken hull, scattering fragments of steel and bone into the darkness. Above it, satellites trace orbits born of that same rivalry, reminders of an age when nations gambled everything for knowledge that could not be spoken. Project Azorian remains more than an operation. It is a mirror of human nature, brilliant, reckless, driven by fear and curiosity in equal measure. The men who conceived it believed they were defending the free world. Perhaps they were. But in chasing the unreachable, they proved something greater, that even in the pursuit of power, humanity's deepest struggle is not with its enemies, but with its own secrecy. History is often written by those who act, the narrator might say, yet sometimes, the world is changed by those who simply try to uncover what lies beneath. If you found this story intriguing, explore the next chapter in Cold War Files, each episode revealing another hidden truth buried in the shadows of history. Subscribe and keep watching the deep.